Hi everyone, I have another book to read with you. This is Little Miss Chatterbox by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Chatterbox talked more than a lot. She talked all the time, day in and day out, week after week, month after month, and year in and year out. She never stopped. She didn't know it, but she even talked in her sleep. She had a brother, but I bet you can guess what his name was. Can't you? That's right, Mr. Chatterbox. She looks a bit like him, don't you think? You should have heard them when they got together. You couldn't get a word in edgewise, or sideways, or anyways. Have you ever heard about somebody being able to talk the hind leg off a donkey? Well, Mr. Chatterbox could talk both hind legs off a donkey, and his sister could talk the hind leg off an elephant. Now, that is a story about a time little Miss Chatterbox decided to get herself a job, which she did, in a bank in Happy Land. At 10 o'clock one Monday morning, Mr. Happy strolled into Happy to Lend You Bank, in the middle of Happy Town. He took out his checkbook, wrote a check, and went to the counter. Behind the counter, on her first morning at work, stood little Miss Chatterbox. She smiled at Mr. Happy. Mr. Happy smiled back. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "Well," said Mrs. Chatterbox, taking a deep breath. For the time of year, it's a good morning, but not as good as the morning we had yesterday, and I dare say tomorrow morning will be even better morning. But it's quite good morning for a Monday morning." And she went on and on and on until it was time for the bank to close. Mr. Happy was still standing there with his mouth open in amazement. He'd been there for hours. "And now," continued little Miss Chatterbox, "it's time for the bank to close, and time for me to go home and say goodbye, and nice talking to you." And she went home, leaving poor Mr. Happy without any money. The following morning, she was fired. She got herself another job in a restaurant. They eat a lot. It was Tuesday, and at noon Mr. Greedy walked into the restaurant and sat himself down at his usual corner table. He always ate there on Tuesdays because that was the day they served extra large portions. The waitress came up to take his order. "What's the soup of the day, Mr. Greedy?" asked the waitress. "Well," said Mrs. Chatterbox, for she was the waitress, "the soup of the day is tomato, but we also have other soups on the menu, such as oxtail and vegetable and chicken noodle, but we have lots of other things to start with, such as," and she went on and on and on until midnight. Mr. Greedy was still sitting there listening in amazement. He'd been there for 12 hours listening. "And now," continued little Miss Chatterbox, "it's time for the Eat-A-Lot restaurant to close and for me to go home, so say goodbye and nice talking to you." And she went home, leaving poor Mr. Greedy feeling rather empty. The next morning she was fired, and the same thing happened all week long. On Thursday morning she was fired from her job as an assistant in a hat shop. Mrs. Splendid went to the shop to buy herself a new hat, but she couldn't. "Oh, madame, I have just the hat for you, and I know you're going to love it because it's pink, and pink is your color." And it was all talk and no hat. On Friday morning she was fired from her job as a secretary to Mr. Uppity. Mr. Uppity, incidentally, was the richest man in the world. I just thought that you'd like to know. But poor Mr. Uppity didn't make any money that day that poor Miss Chatterbox was working for him. Oh, no. "Oh, Mr. Uppity, I've never worked in an office before, and it isn't exciting, and wouldn't you like a cup of coffee, and are you as rich as everybody says you are?" And it was all talk and no work. But this story has a happy ending because at the very end of that week, little Miss Chatterbox managed to find herself a job that suited her down to the ground and up to the sky. That Saturday evening, Mr. Chatterbox was at home in the Chatterbox cottage, which is where he lived. Mr. Chatterbox was mad because his watch had stopped, and he had arranged to meet little Miss Sunshine at 7 o'clock, and he had no idea what time it was. So he decided to call the time and find out what time it was. He dialed the number. At the tone, the time will be 6:25 and 15 seconds. Little Miss Chaterbox took a deep breath. Beep. At the tone, the time will be 6:25 and 26 seconds. Beep. That's funny, thought Mr. Chatterbox to himself. That sounds just like my sister. Bye.